So
So I have to try to be here.
try to be different.
I resist my natural penchant to wander around. Delighted to be here and to speak today on I think a really interesting problem, interesting challenge for many of us, if not all of us here in this room. This is joint work with Lena Lankowski, who is at Aalto University, and David Ronegard, who is at INSEAD. And the main focus of my talk is on who's responsible and the possibility of misattributions of moral responsibility when AI systems are used in organizations. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of the backstory to this, how we came to be looking at this question. So to get us into it, let me just share with you what I think is really a very thought-provoking quote from E.O. Wilson, the late scientist of some renown. He said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." And he's thinking there about digital technology, and it's particularly applicable to AI. So AI systems have entered the moral domain. AI, then, the ability of machines to perform human-like cognitive tasks. And they're ubiquitous, right? They're entering into all aspects of our daily lives. And there are moral consequences as a result. As of today, the world's first comprehensive legislation around AI is the EU AI Act, enacted last year, rolling into effect over the coming few months. And one of the things the EU AI Act does is classify the different types of risk that are associated with AI, ranging from minimal to no risk to unacceptable risk, including some things that will be prohibited, at least within the EU. So, for example, emotion recognition in the workplace or in education. When we use AI systems, the moral responsibility for harm that might result from those risks is unclear. So if we think about what happens with AI systems, we have machine learning, right? So there's the part where the machine is set up with the training and the training data, and then it goes live, and you have machine learning while the machine is engaging with the real world. And at either of those stages, something could go wrong. And something could go wrong in the latter stage where the machine is learning without us realizing that. So the algorithm is not just simply programmed, it's also adaptive and operating independently. Now, I want to just make a clarification here. I'm primarily talking about moral responsibility, and that is distinct from causal and legal responsibility. So causal responsibility is whether you attribute the cause to a particular thing or person, and they caused it, but are they actually at the same time morally responsible for the outcome? And I'll say some more about that a little bit later, and about legal responsibility. I hope you like this. Oops, I didn't. Sorry, my apologies. Wait. Okay, we have
So the
wrong
ones that
display.
we see, that we see aren't there. So let's click here. Try to use your clicker to see if we can advance there.
Okay.
Okay. There we the ones we see are.
Oh, so you missed all these wonderful pictures I have up here of the different applications of AI and the different types of risk. You're all very polite. You know, is there something wrong with the presentation? Anyway, there we go. So where was I going with that? to this and to saying that we've got the situation here with AI where the algorithm is not just simply programmed, as would happen during the training phase, but also once it's out there in the real world, is potentially learning still and then adapting and acting independently. And that gets us to thinking about this question of moral responsibility as distinct from causal responsibility. And this neat picture we have here, which I give credit to Lena Lankowski for finding, is sort of indicating, here's your human, here's your AI system, and here it is off on its own, right? Cutting its strings and doing its own thing. So that's sort of setting out very briefly as an introduction, the focus around who is responsible. For the talk, I'm going to back into now the actual origins of the project, which was around corporate responsibility meeting the digital economy. And then I'll move into looking at who do people actually hold responsible. So this is the research around responsibility attributions that people make relative to AI systems, and then turn to an ontological account of who is responsible. So what would philosophers answer to the question of who is responsible? And then out of those, out of looking at what people think and what philosophers say, we identify a typology of misattributions, which I'll share with you, and they have implications and potentially some ideas for remedy. Now, let me just say the first half is coming from a paper which is an invited submission to California Management Review, so that bit's done. Not really looking for any feedback on that, but happy to hear it. But very interested to hear, especially what you have to say, though, on the second half, where it's very much a work in progress. Any questions or comments thus far? And I'm happy to take questions as we go along. Is that the norm here? Yeah. Do it. Okay. All right. So let's move into the first part then. Corporate responsibility meets the digital economy, and this is primarily work actually I've been doing with Lena. Just wondering can we move that Zoom this thing out of the way?
This is for the Zoom, so I'm not sure you can take it out of the way.
You get a swap, but shouldn't
Okay, so the same,
sure.
Well, I could shut that, right?
I think if you
I'm just shutting that one, maybe.
yeah.
Então, foi o Zoom, não.
Si je fais ça, je peux te suivre tout de suite.
Tu peux le baisser ou...
Pas le baisser.
Pas certain.
Okay.
Usually what I can I don't know.
It's okay. I think we can see
Yeah.
pretty much most of it, right?
I don't know if you're on the right way.
I'll just skip over the slides. So, so, all right. So we're familiar with all the statements of superfluous statements, perhaps, or statements that are expressing how. I guess the word is superlative, right? The superlative statements that have been made around how digital technology is changing our lives and will continue to do so. So the classic is everything that can be digital will be. And Lena and I, pre-COVID, so this is going back a few years now, we're thinking, well, what does digitalization mean for the field of corporate responsibility? And how fundamental are the changes that it brings to the field? So what we were not interested in is what are the corporate responsibility issues associated with particular forms of digital technology. We were interested in the inverse from that. What does digital technology mean for the field of corporate responsibility? And there are various literatures out there where people have actually looked at the implications of digital technology for different fields. And we're just doing that with corporate responsibility. And so when we think about digitalization and corporate responsibility, the field of corporate responsibility is very much focused around stakeholder relationships. So we take a stakeholder-centric approach to the key digital phenomena and say, well, what does that mean for the field? And this, okay, it stopped moving forward again. Let's see, what happens if I use this instead? No.
So it's just a matter of
Oh,
clicking there.
clicking.
But I also, somebody from the audience just gave me the information about how to hide this. And there you go.
Perfect. Okay. Very good. Okay, so what this figure is attempting to show is the relationship between the firm and its stakeholders and how they're affected by key digital phenomena. I'm not saying we've necessarily got every key digital phenomena here, but I think we have certainly some of the more important ones. So digital marketing, algorithmic management, autonomous processes in products and services, the sharing economy, and we'd include in that platforms and transparency and stakeholder governance. And those digital phenomena then, where the firm is acting in respect of those technologies, have an impact on its stakeholders. And that's something of central concern to people in the corporate responsibility field. Equally, the firm can be impacting stakeholders through the sharing economy and transparency and stakeholder governance. But there's also a reciprocal effect in that stakeholders can also impact the firm through the sharing economy and through the increased transparency that comes with digital technologies. And what we've got then are various new ways by which these relationships between stakeholders are becoming manifest. Make sense? Yeah, okay. And so this is a busy slide, I recognize, but what we set out to do was to look at those digital economy phenomena and say, well, what do they mean in terms of opportunities, ethical opportunities, and ethical threats? And so you've got each of them here: digital marketing, algorithmic management. So for instance, in monitoring employees, in Amazon employees in warehouses, for instance, autonomous processes in products and services. So algorithms used in recruitment, autonomous weapons systems, self-operating vehicles, the sharing economy. So Uber, Mechanical Turk, Airbnb. And then this transparency and stakeholder governance is basically recognizing that digitalization, bringing with it social media especially, can empower stakeholders, enabling greater perhaps stakeholder governance and just simply greater transparency all around. And you can see then here are the opportunities and threats. And I won't go into those in any great detail unless somebody particularly wants to stop me and have me do that. But just to illustrate the point, if you take digital marketing, so thinking about personalized targeting of messages, thinking about dynamic personalized pricing, what does that mean? Well, a positive could be companies better understand consumer needs. So the marketers are happy about that. It could mean lower prices for some consumers. So companies practice price discrimination, and there are some consumers who benefit from lower prices. Mostly though, my experience, I don't know about yours, is it gives them an opportunity to charge us higher prices, right? And of course, there are a lot of issues around consumer privacy and autonomy. Now, as I say, this isn't the primary focus of the talk. This is sort of setting the scene for the who's responsible part, but I could go into any of that in detail if you like. But let me show you where we went with it next. So if you think about the field of corporate responsibility and the domain of that field, there's essentially three core questions at the heart of the field. Responsible for what? So when we think about corporate responsibility, what are the issues that companies are responsible for from a stakeholder theoretic perspective? Responsible towards whom? Who are we, thinking about? Who are the moral patients, to use some of the technical language here? And who's responsible? Whose responsibility is it when there are these issues associated with digitalization? And what we found in looking at those key digital phenomena and some more was this. When we ask the question, well, what are companies responsible for? What we find is that existing corporate responsibility issues become manifest in novel ways. So, for example, if you think about the big concern we have around being replaced by robots in our work, that's not a new corporate responsibility issue. It's a new issue in the fact that, robots, bots can do things that humans can do and maybe better, and that's going to put us out of work, but that's not a new corporate responsibility issue. Existing corporate responsibility issues may be alleviated or solved. There are all sorts of great things that digitalization is bringing. So the fact that with medical image analysis, a machine can do it better than a human being is a good thing. It's going to be more likely to spot that tumor. And then existing corporate responsibility issues can be intensified as a result of digitalization. So if we think about consumer data collection, it's not a new issue that companies collect data on us, and there are issues there of privacy, issues of how they may use that data to manipulate us. But the granularity and the quantity of data that's available today makes that a much more intense issue. And then there is the possibility of new corporate responsibility issues arising. And Lena and I are not entirely convinced that there are new corporate responsibility issues, but the closest we get to that is with the harms of social media. All of the problems of addiction, of mental health, of loss of attention. Don't know about your students here, but keeping their attention for more than 10 minutes in the class, it's a struggle, right? And then at a societal level, how social media is being used to distort elections, how it creates polarization in society. There's a whole set of individual and societal social harms that come from social media. And arguably, those are new corporate responsibility issues. The second question then is responsible towards whom? And here we're thinking about the stakeholders that companies are responsible towards, and the possibility that the salience of existing stakeholder groups may change. So here we're thinking about the power, the legitimacy of stakeholder groups, and how potentially through social media especially, groups that were less powerful, seen as less legitimate, are better able to assert their rights, their claim to be stakeholders, and therefore the companies will need to give them a higher priority. And then there's the possibility, again, this is a possibility of new stakeholder groups emerging And here we think the candidate would be would be the AI system itself as a moral patient. Now, we're not arguing this, but there's certainly people out there who are, that maybe the AI system is a stakeholder. And then the third question is who's responsible? And what we see is a much greater blurring of the boundaries between firms and individuals and among firms, and also between firms and machines. So remember, we set out in this project asking, well, what does digitalization mean for the field of corporate responsibility? And for the most part, we're saying it doesn't actually change a whole lot, with these exceptions that I've highlighted here, right? The possibility that new corporate responsibility issues will arise if they haven't already arisen. The possibility of new stakeholder groups emerging, and this would be the people who are claiming that were claiming robot rights. I mean, there's a book by David Gunkel, Robot Rights. And then in terms of who's responsible, this is where we see most of the action. And in fact, in terms of telling the story of this project, when we submitted this paper to Business and Society, the reviewers came back and said, well, we like that bit at the end where you talk about who's responsible, but get rid of the rest. So that's the bit that we then chose to focus on. And the paper as a whole, as I mentioned already, that's an invited submission to California Management Review, so no longer positioned as an academic paper, is positioned more as a paper speaking primarily to managers. And let me just share with you some of the managerial implications of asking this question about what does digitalization do for the field of CR. And we would say, firstly, it provides, or what we do is provide a framework for thinking about corporate responsibility obligations relative to digitalization. So those, very simply, are the three questions. So managers have a framework around responsible for what, responsible to whom, and who's responsible. There are actions that managers may need to take with respect to corporate responsibility issues that are made manifest in new ways, that are more intense than they were hitherto, or potentially corporate responsibility issues that have been resolved, or at least are less important now through solutions provided by digital technology. And there is, as I mentioned, the possibility of new corporate responsibility issues arising. Thirdly, then, there are the changes in stakeholder salience and the different prioritization, particularly for previously underrepresented stakeholders, and the possibility of new stakeholders emerging. So this is the idea of robots as moral patients. Fourthly, then, from the point of view of the double materiality analysis that companies are doing nowadays, thinking about their impacts on society and what those impacts and impacts financially as a consequence of sustainability and corporate responsibility. This analysis will change as the issues change, as this priority of stakeholders changes, and indeed ever more quickly given the speed of change. And then finally, the responsibility gaps that can emerge when we think about the question, who is responsible? So responsibility gaps exist where we can't be sure who actually is the responsible party. And what managers need to think about as of today is how to create clear responsibility boundaries, for example, in negotiations with other parties, other firms, and in contracts, and to consider what the legal ramifications are, particularly the possibility of the imposition of strict liability. And I'll say some more on that. So that's it in terms of the first part, and setting the scene then for thinking about who is responsible. So what I'd like to do now is turn to what the research says about who people attribute responsibility to. And there have been a bunch of studies in this area, and here you have some key studies. And the bottom line coming out of these studies is that people will sometimes attribute moral responsibility to AI systems. And people have found that in the context of doing the classic trolley type experiments. You know, you've got a runaway trolley, it's on a path that's going to diverge. It goes down one path, kills one person, goes down another path, it kills 5 people, and you sort of play with that basic scenario. And if the decision maker who makes the decision whether or not to activate the switch, to switch the track, is a human or a robot, people are likely to give less responsibility to humans than to robots. There are various studies that have taken real world events as scenarios and asked, you know, if the actor is a machine or a robot or a human, you know, where do they attribute responsibility? Sometimes it's more to humans, sometimes it's more to the machine. And there are also studies that are not so many that have looked at joint agency. So the prior examples are single agency, one person, one machine. They've also looked then at joint agency where the machines and humans are combined. So think about a self-driving car where there's actually a driver in there as well. What's the distribution of responsibility between the machine and the people? And again, Lou and Du in this instance, there's a crash in a self-driving car, semi-autonomous vehicle, caused by the human who failed to react to a warning, and the automation system that failed to send a warning. Where does the blame lie? People say it's more in the machine than in the human. Now, an important caveat to these studies, we can get into the detail if you're interested, is in terms of how the empirical work was conducted and the questions that were asked around attributing responsibility, because sometimes the questions could have been interpreted as being about causal responsibility, not moral responsibility. Just see if I can give you an illustration of that. So probably, if you just take the one at the top there, the Mal their operationalization of responsibility attribution was how much blame does X, so the robot or the machine, deserve for directing or not directing the train towards the single miner. And so arguably, people might say, well, that's maybe more causal than moral, but there are definitely other studies where it's very clear cut that it's about moral responsibility. So seemingly there's some evidence to suggest that people do in fact attribute responsibility to AI systems. Why do they do that? Well, the essence of the answer to that question is if there is a perceived mind at work. And so how do people see a mind at work in the action of the machine? Well, how involved is that AI system in the decision making? So how proximal is it? How independently is it operating? How is it portrayed? So a lot of research has, reflected in this picture here around personification of AI systems. And note that I'm using the word AI system, and I'm doing that deliberately, as opposed to simply saying AI, because there's sort of a personification when we refer to AI, right? it's sort of like it's another person out there. Oh, it's the AI. No, it's the AI system that we should be referring to. And there's a lot of effort, to actually make AI systems seem human-like, right? And that perhaps this is sort of giving rise to some sort of cognitive bias, where you personify the AI system, and people think it's going to be morally responsible. Think about the chatbots that are given names and are given, I don't know, glasses to make them look sort of older or wiser or whatever. And then just generally, if you think about how AI is portrayed in society, particularly in movies, and there's sort of less certainty around this in terms of these are more our speculations rather than research studies. The characteristics of the person assessing the AI system, so how tech savvy are they, for example, and then the nature of the moral issue. So what sort of issue is at stake morally? What are the norms? What are the expectations around that issue? So that's the piece around how do people think about responsibility in relation to AI systems. Let me just pause for a moment. Any questions on what I've said so far?
Observation I made. I like how the first paper you mentioned what is new and what is a new manifestation of something that existed before. And here, when you mention responsibility attributed to AI system, I'm thinking if that is new too, in the sense that I recall years ago, for example, you call an airline and you had a problem with your ticket, and then the airline said, "Oh, it's caused by the system," right? Or similar situation, right? So I was wondering if it has been identified before AI.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. I think so AI has been around for a long time, right? Like 50 years or so, at least. But it's only recently become as powerful, right, as it is today. With the high-powered computing that came out of gaming technology, right? And it's that power combined with big data that makes a problem of inconvenience where some computer systems getting blamed, very different. Right. But I think it's a fair point. Yeah.
Maybe just contrast that it's different because the system from being caused by the system 15 years ago, it was an engineering problem because it's a system that wasn't learning, it was just complex and built by humans. Now that attribution of responsibility is not as clear cut because maybe the chatbot has, it was in a state when it was deployed, for which maybe responsibility could have been attributed to the developer, but then once it was deployed and run and retrained to use, no longer the problem of the response of the development. It becomes responsible in a way, right? There was a couple of weeks ago the problem with the chatbot by Air Canada who sold tickets. And there was a judge who called the company to order and said, Air Canada, you come to respect whatever the chatbot issue as tickets, it's a valid ticket. So you're on the hook for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a great example. So firstly, the general point is one. 15 years ago, computer system, the program, and some human was responsible for programming it and made a mistake, presumed, right? Today, it could be the AI system that has generated an answer that is wrong. And it may be wrong because of how it was trained, it may be wrong because of what it's learned. And then the question is, as you say, much more difficult to answer in terms of who's responsible. In the Air Canada example, I think the plaintiff was saying that he went through the site, the chatbot said that Air Canada had a bereavement policy that would enable him to get a discounted flight. And Air Canada fought that on the grounds that the AI system was a separate legal entity. So in a sense, it's the AI, my lord, Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
In the studies you had mentioned before, did any of them distinguish between assigning responsibility to the AI system or the developer of the AI system?
So a good point, and I'll come to that in a moment, because that's where we get into this problem of, a familiar problem in philosophy, but a particularly challenging problem in the context of AI systems, and that is many hands. Right, so who's involved? Who is the responsible party? And where were you going to go with that? Were you going to take it a step further, or?
No, well, just what we were describing here, that how we perceive AI systems to be a person on its own. In the examples you provided before from those studies, I would have assumed that people were not assigning responsibility to the AI system as a person, but to the developer.
So, I can't think of a study where that's specific of the studies I referenced there. There is a study actually where, so they were studying Nike, right? Just, consumers in general. There is a study that's based on interviews with AI professionals. And AI professionals are ready to blame the system or individual parties that make up the system. And I'll speak some more about who those parties are in a moment. All right, so let's move to this second part then. So that's who people think is responsible. And who is responsible from an ontological perspective, which is a different question and a question which we look to philosophy to answer. And if you ask, well, can an AI system be morally responsible? The short answer, very simply, is no, and we could, move on and find something else to talk about. But it's more nuanced than that. So let me just dig into the philosophy a little bit. So philosophers have spent hundreds of years thinking about moral agency, maybe thousands of years actually, and they don't agree in terms of what makes for moral agency. But there again, if you put two people together and they talk about philosophical issues, and they do agree, one of them can't be a philosopher. So what does the literature say? Well, we can't agree on the necessary and sufficient conditions for moral agency. Moral agency in any context, right? But we can identify the necessary conditions for moral agency, or at least there is a fair amount of agreement on that. So David Ronegard, who's a long-standing co-author of mine, came into the project at this point. He's somebody that's done a lot of work around corporate moral agency. And so the question here might be, if you take the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. So oil well blows up. Who's responsible? Well, when that's framed as a question of corporate moral agency, a lot of people say, well, it's BP. BP's to blame for that. Many philosophers would say, well, no, it can't be a company. How can a company be morally responsible? It's the individuals within the company that was morally responsible for that accident. And then when we come to AI systems, then we've got the same sort of question at work. You know, who's responsible when something goes wrong and AI systems are involved? And the necessary conditions, at least around which there's a fair degree of agreement, for moral agency. So what would make for somebody being a moral agent is that they're able to perform an action, they're able to intend an action, and they're able to autonomously choose an action. Now, when it comes to AI systems, they can clearly perform actions. When you think about them being able to intend an action, there it becomes a little bit murky. So some views on intentionality would say, actually, we can see intentionality in the sense that it's predictable, right? So if you imagine a kid's toy with a spring, you wind up the spring and set the toy off. You know, maybe it's a dog or something, and it goes off along the table, right? And it performs an action, so it has agency in that respect. And it also, if, for example, it knocks over my cup of water, you may actually say, well, it sort of intended that action because it was set off and off it went. And we could have said, well, actually, if you set off a toy in that direction towards the cup, you know, we know it's going to knock the cup over. And so in that sense of intentionality, the predictive sense, we're able to say it's able to intend an action. Now, that, however, isn't how many philosophers would look at this in terms of intentionality. So Harry Frankfurt, for instance, would disagree with that view because it's not aware in doing that. So to use that metaphor again, you know, that spring projected toy in knocking the cup over, it's not aware that it's doing that. Right? And that brings us to this question of being able to autonomously choose an action. So this is about being free to choose, but also choosing what to choose. And this is where the idea of second order intentionality comes in. So in this sort of classic account by Harry Frankfurt, it's somewhat controversial today because he talks about animals in a way that we might think of them a little differently today. But he says, imagine an animal that chooses one type of food over another. So it's free to choose those two different types of food. Contrast that with a human being who says, well, I'm going to eat something vegetarian instead of the meat. Again, the human being has made a choice. I'm taking the vegetarian option, but the reasoning for doing that lies not just in choosing between these two food items, but because the human being doesn't want to kill animals. And so the second order intentionality is not to kill animals. And for that to happen, you have to have awareness. And that is why when we think about AI systems, you've got the cross there, because at least today they do not have awareness. Any questions or comments on that?
On the first one, being able to perform an action.
Yeah.
On AI, the ability to perform an action is given. It's given by developers. And we can totally constrain an AI to not perform the action, just to learn and show it patterns of medicine.
You could,
Yeah.
yeah.
So is it as clear cut as
So I guess you would say
give action?
it can perform some actions, but not others, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's yeah, I mean, if you take a chess computer, right? It can perform, it can play a game of chess. They can't then suddenly decide it's going to go play golf, right?
Now,
I'm not really sure.
Unless it's been now, and unless it's been set up to do that thing. Yeah.
In the sense that like ourselves human, our ability to perform action is very easy. We can we learn to grasp things. On AI, you have to do with
But with machine learning, it can learn to do things that, I mean, if you think about artificial limbs, you know, you program artificial limbs, and my understanding is that with the latest iteration, they can actually learn how to manipulate the hand in ways that haven't already been anticipated or programmed. Yeah.
Just like a clarification, when you talk about awareness of the fact that they are aware that they have the impact. So they are choose, right? It's like awareness.
It's, I mean, there are other words we could use. It's like,
Wondering what.
are you conscious?
This contract.
Yeah, conscious. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just say that is the standard conception. And that's very likely the argument that, well, it's certainly the argument that we're advancing in the paper as it is now. But there's a side note, and that is that there are other and increasingly other alternative views that are coming to the fore. One person who's been very active in this space is David Gunkel. Anybody seen any of the books by David Gunkel or heard of David Gunkel? Yeah, some familiarity there. And this is the third in his trilogy, Person, Thing, Robot. And one of he starts out this book with a very interesting opening. He says, you know, throughout human history, we've thought of there being two categories, people and things, and they're very different. And people have rights, you know, and they have responsibilities, and there's a whole lot of things that go with being a person that don't apply when you start thinking about things. Things don't have rights. You know, we don't have to protect things. And his argument in this book is that actually with AI, it's seemingly we're opening up the possibility of something between the two, something that's neither a person nor a thing. And just putting it a little bit differently, so this is summarizing a considerable amount of literature that's come out over the past 5 years. There are people who, in contrast to the standard conception, argue for a functionalist approach, which basically says, well, if we think about moral agency serving some sort of function, then, you know, maybe it's a different type of moral agency we need to be thinking about when it comes to AI systems. So that's one school of alternative thought. The other is relationalist. And this is saying that it's what's sometimes called an as-if strategy. If we see an AI system as a relevant moral actor, then that system is worthy of moral consideration. Now, I'm not entirely convinced of these alternative viewpoints, at least as of now. So I'm adhering to the standard conception, as are Lena and David in our work on this project, but we certainly feel it needs to be acknowledged. All right, let me move us on then to the question. Well, if it's not the AI system that's morally responsible, well, who is it? And this is where we need to think in terms of two types of vicarious relationship that can exist between a principal and an agent. So think about people as principals and agents, and you have the principal directing an agent to carry out a series of tasks, and that's all they're allowed to do. Their behavior is entirely circumscribed. Or conversely, you have a principal who directs an agent to do something on their behalf, but you're expecting them, perhaps as a professional, to exercise some judgment. And this may be, for instance, a lawyer. You're hiring a lawyer to act on your behalf. Now, in that second type, that type 2 example, some responsibility can lie with the agent acting on your behalf because they're exercising their professional judgment and they therefore are operating in some ways independently of you, the principal. With the type 1, that doesn't happen. And that we would say, because AI systems do not, at least today, have autonomy, it's a type 1 relationship. So just to take you through it then, so humans are the principal then, AI systems are an agent. Are the outcomes aligned? And this word alignment is very important in the AI world, right? So designers of AI systems are looking to achieve alignment. So they design the AI system such that the outcomes are aligned with their expectations. Well, sometimes that doesn't happen, right? But if they are aligned, then it can only be the humans that are responsible. If they weren't aligned, then we have this question, was sufficient care exercised by the people developing the AI system and possibly others? And then if the answer is no, there wasn't sufficient care, then humans are to blame. If the answer is yes, then no one is to blame. And that's something we have to allow as a possibility, that maybe no one is to blame for what happened. Bad stuff happens, and no one is to blame for that. I don't know what the truth of the situation is as of now, but if you take the collapse of the Baltimore Bridge a couple of days ago, something that I'm staying in Philadelphia at the moment, so very paying close attention to that. Some container ship goes into a major support for the bridge, the whole thing falls down. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, so it weren't a lot of people on it, but people were on it and people died as a consequence. Quite possibly, no one is to blame for that accident. That, it wasn't some negligence by the crew or the people who maintain the vessel. I don't know, I'm speculating, but quite possibly that will turn out to be the case. Now, that doesn't mean to say legally there isn't somebody going to be liable for that and having to pay. But in terms of moral responsibility, if no one is actually truly to blame, then you can't say there's a person who is morally responsible. Okay, let me move on. To the problem of many hands, right? So this is in part to your question earlier about, well, who in developing the system is to blame. So philosophers have, long time wrestled with the problem that sometimes it's very difficult to know who is morally responsible because lots of different people were involved. And that can be especially true with AI systems. And so Sullivan and Foster-Wamba, for example, say, well, we could be thinking about the initiation phase, the business owners, the data scientists, the data providers, the building and the training phase. So, building the system, training the AI, and the engineers, the data scientists, the robotics engineers, the manufacturers, in the deployment phase, and then in the managing and operating phase. So lots of different people potentially involved. And where does the blame lie if something goes wrong? Who is morally responsible? The answer isn't always going to be clear. So let me stop at that point again. Let's just see if there are any questions or comments.
I was just thinking, isn't that why we would blame, for example, a corporation? We would say no one individually was responsible, but
Yeah.
the functioning of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Added
And I'm with you on that, and I'm in that sense different in the position I take to my co-author David Ronegard. So we've both done work on corporate moral agency, and I'm sort of more of the school that actually it isn't always easy to identify an individual or set of individuals, and maybe there is some sort of notion of collective responsibility that's possible. And there are theorists on group agency who would advocate that point of view. Yeah.
In the previous slide, so you were talking about sufficient care.
Yeah.
But what is sufficient care? Because since you know that the machine is autonomous, you know that there's uncertainty, and you know it's a known unknown. So since you know that there's an unknown, it seems to me like sufficient care would be to not take the risk.
So that is I was going to say $1 million question. That's probably the $1 billion question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there is work underway to try and develop an understanding of what would constitute sufficient care. I think we can look to norms in particular industries, but again, it's not an easy question to answer, and that a lot of work is needed on that question.
About not an expert in this question, but not really convinced about the ontological distinction between moral and legal responsibility, because in this example, if no one is responsible, if you take the example of the Baltimore Bridge, then you say no one is responsible based on that on that kind of thinking, but ultimately people gonna think that someone is responsible, and as we said, we blame a firm or we blame someone. So what, and it's people gonna set up the rules and laws to blame someone. So a company has been given like is a moral person. So in the end, isn't always gonna be someone. There's gonna be people who gonna think that a thing is responsible, and
So I think, I mean, I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a moment, but two answers for now, or 2 points for now. One is, you're right, there is a sort of psychological bias to blame somebody. We don't like the idea that there's no one to blame. And secondly, when it comes to the law, you can have situations of strict liability where no one is identifiable as the morally responsible party. And there is no fault required, but there is still a party that is legally responsible. So with that ship, probably the shipping company, the owner of the ship, is liable. I'm sure.
I have a question from the online audience
Yeah.
that goes in the same vein.
They're asking, can you stand in front of the camera?
The question is from Dominique Martin, who's a professor of ethics, organizational ethics and business ethics at UQAM. So he says, if we claim that no one is morally responsible when sufficient care is exercised, in the case that the outcomes are aligned, does that create risk that the designers and producer of AI system will fail to honor the responsibilities in developing reliable systems beforehand?
Yeah.
And he says that most contemporary views about responsibility claim that legal responsibility and other forms of social responsibility follow from moral responsibility to some extent. So if there's a possibility no one is to blame, will it be incentivize the developers to produce
Yeah, no.
highly reliable systems.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very good point. And we do need to think about those incentives. But I would add that, we are talking about moral responsibility and not legal responsibility. So building on the prior question, legal responsibility may still be there, even if there was sufficient care. Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the typology of misattributions. And this is very simply taking those two different perspectives and putting them into a matrix. And so we're asking, well, what is the ontological account of moral responsibility? Who do we think is responsible? Is it the AI system, salient humans, no one? And where in practice do people see the moral responsibility or attribute the moral responsibility to be? Those AI systems, salient humans, or no one? Make sense? And then if we look at the first row, we can actually very quickly dismiss it, move on from there, because the ontological account basically says the AI system cannot be morally responsible. At least that's the standard conception, right? So when we move on then to looking at salient humans are seen to be the responsible party, and they are ontologically correctly attributed with responsibility. That's the scenario we have here, 2A. Conversely, we've got a situation where no one is seen to be responsible and no one is actually attributed with moral responsibility. So those are the straightforward cases, right? Then we have what we see as 4 potential misattributions. So where there's a mismatch between where responsibility lies according to the ontological account and where people think responsibility lies. And we call these hiding behind AI. So that's where human was responsible, but it's the AI system that's been blamed. So we've talked about that. That's the Air Canada example. Getting lost in the crowd. This is where the many hands problem comes in, right? So many people involved in developing the AI system. We don't know who is responsible. It was probably some individual, or at least we should be saying it's some individual or set of individuals, but actually it's very difficult to identify who that person or people are. And then we've got these 2 scenarios here. We're familiar with the idea of a crumple zone, right, on a vehicle. So if you crash your car into another car, if it's a relatively modern vehicle, the front of the vehicle will crumple up, protecting the passenger cell behind it, right? So that's the idea of a crumple zone. And what some authors have referred to in this space is the idea that maybe AI becomes the moral crumple zone. So this is where no one is actually morally responsible, but the AI system is given the blame. Conversely, again, no one is responsible, but the humans involved are given the blame. Okay, so does that make sense before I just go into a little bit more detail? So if we take hiding behind the AI, come in.
Est-ce que vous voulez que je revienne pour les biscuits ou
Tantôt, ou juste te laisser à l'extérieur.
ouais, je te laisse faire.
Let's see. So with and let me give you a worked example across the 4 scenarios. So imagine the classic AI system mistake in hiring, right? There's been a lot written about this, lots of examples of this, where there is bias in the AI system, either as a result of the training or as a result of how the machines learned during the course of its operation, and discriminatory hiring outcomes result. So people are discriminated on the basis of gender or race or whatever, right? And what might happen then is that the AI system was not well trained. It was discriminatory in outcome. What happens when there's an expression of concern about that? Well, it's the AI system to blame, right? People hide behind the AI, and it may even be some sort of strategic scapegoating going on here. People sort of intentionally trying to blame the AI to cover up for their own mistakes. And consistent with the question we had from Zoom, maybe there's less incentive here for the humans to prevent those sort of moral violations. The second scenario, then, getting lost in the crowd. This is avoiding responsibility because, since it's possible to do so, because the responsible parties are difficult to identify. Again, less incentive for humans to prevent moral violations. And this might be, that AI hiring system was developed by multiple parties, and we just can't figure out who exactly is the responsible party. AI is moral crumple zone, discriminatory hiring outcome again. This is due perhaps to machine learning errors, and the blame is put on the AI. It's the AI that's done it. And then finally, and what that might mean is that there are implications for the developers and users of the system, and it may discourage adoption of AI systems as a consequence. And then finally, the managers are unfairly blamed, and they may receive unjust sanctions as a consequence. So, any questions or comments? Let me move on towards a close then, and to share with you some really sort of underdeveloped ideas around remedies. So I'm not making any great claims here, but if we think about this from a legislative and policymaker perspective, how do we prevent harm when we're thinking about the sort of examples we've been discussing? Well, it may be through the law, right? It may be through legal liability. And what that would mean, going back to the earlier question then, might be thinking around negligence. So negligence is where there can be found fault with a party, but not necessarily intent. So they didn't intend for something to go wrong, for this AI system to engage in discriminatory hiring practices. But it happened nonetheless, and it happened because they were negligent in either developing in the training phase, developing the software, or actually in its implementation by not carefully monitoring it enough. And so there's negligence there. As we heard earlier, though, there's some real problems when it comes to identifying, well, what wouldn't have been negligent, right? What would have been sufficient care? And this problem of many hands. When it comes to strict liability, by contrast, you don't have to demonstrate fault. It's already built in, it's baked in that there is a responsible party. That's what's called single entry point strict liability. There is one clearly identified party a priori. Another approach that's been mooted is what's called common enterprise strict liability, where the liability would a priori be established as shared among multiple parties to the project. So those are some thoughts around the legal remedies. From a policymaker point of view, there are things policymakers can do, require greater disclosure of the use of AI systems, restrict, if you think about some of the factors that give rise to people attributing responsibility to AI systems, restrict personification when it comes to AI systems. So, reduce the potential for people to think there's some sort of mind at work when they engage with an AI system. Policies around providing extra care for vulnerable users, and just education more generally, so people are more clued into what AI systems are and do. And then when it comes to what organizations can do, so there are situations then when humans avoid taking responsibility when they should. So this is hiding behind the AI and getting lost in the crowd. So very simply, accept and assume responsibility. Not perhaps a particularly inspired answer, but there you go. And more nuanced though is this, don't take advantage of this bias we might have to misattribute responsibility. Use care in talking about AI systems in society, not personifying them. They are machines, not people. Getting lost in the crowd, again, sort of the stock answer, will accept the responsibility and assume moral responsibility. And clarify and communicate the role of the multiple parties in any AI system. And then when it comes to the moral crumple zone examples, ensure and communicate that sufficient care was exercised. So we're back to that question of sufficient care. Yeah, so that's it in terms of remedies. So to finish up in terms of where we're going with this paper, what we're hoping the contributions will be, we hope we can show why, at least today, AI systems cannot be morally responsible, and bring attention to that discrepancy between what many people might think is where responsibility lies and where it lies according to the standard conception of the ontological account. We're proposing a novel typology of misattributions, as you just seen, identifying 4 different types of misattributions, which would enable managers and others to think about, finally, the remedies for them. So to conclude, a reminder of the quote from Wilson at the beginning. Management has entered a new era when we think about what digitalization and more specifically AI technology can do. And we're not yet adapted as people or as institutions, firms, other organizations to what is now happening from a technological point of view. Solutions need to be found to prevent and rectify the harms. And we would say that a critical precondition to that is making sure that the attributions of moral responsibility are correct in the first place. Hence, we ask the question, who's responsible? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really inspiring talk. Maybe I have a question before we open the rest of the room. Going away from, so you said your paper is that the non-awareness of AI right now. So are you thinking that maybe in 5 to 10 years you'll have to redo the work? Some people think that some AI are showing proto-consciousness, like some sort of conscience. Some people attribute a little consciousness to ChatGPT or systems like that. So if we in some years we have systems that are becoming aware, I don't know exactly how it's how is it going to change everything about responsibility?
Well, that's where we struggle the most with this project, quite frankly. I mean, to your question, I mean, I would argue today that is when you start saying there's some sort of proto consciousness there. Some people would say that, right? But that may be more of this sort of more more sort of functionalist type
Yeah.
interpretation. You know, is it consciousness as we think of consciousness? And remember, you know, a lot of these ideas around moral agency and what's informing moral philosophy is thinking about what we see in humans, what we look for in humans. If we're saying, well, actually, maybe we should think of moral agency differently, then that's, you know, that's where some people would have us go. I'm not there yet, neither are my co-authors, but you're absolutely right. That's sort of what some people are saying. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, it's just so interesting. I have a question about some of the ontologies you considered. Did you and your authors also kind of consider like a co-constitutive ontology, like a relator, or not really, like if that entered to your, and if how that would change?
Just explain.
Just where humans and non-humans and materials will are co-constituted, and therefore there's a distributed agency kind of set that, you know, not saying. So humans and machines are both, the agency is separated from us.
So is that some idea of joint agency?
Yeah, or
Joint
just
agency and
joint
joint
or
responsibility.
distributed, or exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a 2021 AMR about augmented and distributed agency, depending on how you're considering that relationship, and then that's it. I was just wondering if you had considered.
Not so directly, but I
Okay.
think that's a good, let me make a note of that.
Makes me think of the Neuralink chip. What if you have the AI in you?
It's like the cyborg view, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're, and you know, there's interesting things.
That's an interesting, that's an interesting also. Like, could a person who has a chip, like a chip, like the Neuralink thing, project, blame its own AI for something that that the person has done or something. Like the scapegoating scenario of blaming the AI within yourself. I don't know. It's like a science fiction, but it's there's a guy.
So, you know.
Yeah, but there's a guy actually. Yeah, I think they performed the surgery on some guy last in January or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Because yeah, that if you go back to the way you break down the ontological, like the yes, no, there's attributions, then there would
The
be,
flow chart.
if you have a co-constitutive ontology. I'm so sorry, I should have asked when it was up. One more back. Oh yeah, no, that one. So so yeah, so it's not just yes and no. It would involve like that distributed, which deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't either, but I think it's, you know, it's the sort of thing we have to be potential.
Very quickly, thank you very much, very thoughtful. Do you consider any influence of cultural dimensions in what is moral responsibility, for instance, and where can we draw a line for legal responsibility or national? You talk about the European Union I think, at the beginning. So is there any cultural matter in that, or do you see morality as something universal?
So I think, yeah, no, there's that. I definitely want to put there's a cultural overlay in terms of how people will respond to AI systems, and you could imagine, you know, a big difference, say, between the US and Europe. You know, maybe more protectionist in Europe than in the US. When it comes to moral agency, I'm not sure how a cultural overlay would change the philosophical argument of that. But I may be missing some literature that, yeah.
Just very quickly, I would like to have your thought on our academic world. Where can we, you know, I mean, it's a big issue for students, for professors, for researchers.
Yeah.
And everything, so.
Yeah, well, my 2 cents on that in terms of what I do, I introduced in my teaching of the core ethics course at INSEAD just a few months back, a requirement that students, there were 2 types of evaluation. One was sort of a short online poll that they answered before the class, and I said that you cannot use AI for that. And that would typically be answering a question or 2 questions about a case study they were going to discuss in class. And I didn't want them, just going to the AI answer. Of course, I have to take them, I have to trust them, right? And then for the exam, which was a take-home case study exam, I had I said they could use large language models like ChatGPT, and if they did so, they had to declare that they'd done it, and in addition, provide an explanation of how it helped them. So that, but I don't have any more to offer really.
Are they declaring using it?
And actually, they didn't. But it was clear that they were using it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, at INSEAD, we've got like a really international student body, like 80 different nationalities in promotion. And so only a minority of them have English as their first language. And so they could certainly benefit from using ChatGPT. And some of them may have benefited more than they needed to. We had a question on it from here. No?
Actually, I was reading my handbook because there's also this paper by sorry, I was Megan was talking about this with that if I wanted to add on that. This paper by Ensley, Mika Ensley, from 2023, and there's one on the situation with awareness in human AI teams, and she touched on this objective which might be interesting.
So let me make a note of that.
So it's about what Marion, it's about situational awareness of AI.
Yeah, human AI teams, so it's how, sorry. Yeah, how to relate all this awareness of things relating on another, and how we can go towards making better decision making. Sorry. So it's interesting because she touched on the aspect of responsibility.
And sorry, what's the
What's the author's name?
Ensley.
Ensley?
Ensley, Mika.
Mika Ensley.
How do you spell the Ensley?
Ensley is ENDSLEI. Wise.
Ensley.
Where was that published?
I'm sorry?
Do you know the journal or?
I sent you an email with
Sorry.
Computers and Human Behavior?
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say, if anybody has any further questions or comments.
Oh, write it down on the Zoom also.
Was there anything else on Zoom?
Those are. No, those are, thanks for there's a question. What role can organizational and individual virtue ethics play in preventing the misattribution?
So I like that question because actually that gives some weight to the claim around hiding behind the AI.
Yes.
And the remedy we propose of, well, don't do it.
Don't do
right? Yeah. So I think, yes, there are virtue ethics that I may even use that. Yes, sorry, you had a question.
I think behind the AI, we have in mind someone who probably knows he's responsible and wants to hide behind the AI. But sometimes, someone might be convinced to have exercise sufficient care. And then the whole debate would be that, I exercise sufficient care. And then the problem was the AI system. The problem was the AI system, it might be related to that idea because it was not inside the firm, but it comes from a third party, and then the problem lies there and nothing, you know,
So examples of hiding behind the AI may not be so clear cut.
that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah,
right now.
yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. Yeah. So it seems clear cut in the Air Canada case, but maybe not in many other cases.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the hiding behind the AI, you've got to look at intentions and whether people are doing it intentionally, or whether it's just sort of, happening without sort of some sort of strategic attempt to avoid the blame.
Yeah.
For the sake of time, I'm gonna have to go faster because I have to stop I'll end the Zoom meeting. So for the sake of just keeping the time, we're supposed to finish this seminar at 1. I really want to thank you for this really inspiring talk. A lot to think about. It was I think I'm gonna think about it, and we could have discussed this presentation for a long time. But thank you very much for your breathtaking presentation.
And thank you for your great questions and comments. Really enjoyed that.
Merci à tous les gens qui étaient en présence dans la salle. Peut-être qu'on aura le temps de répondre à une petite question ou deux après. Merci à tous ceux qui étaient présents en ligne. Donc, merci de la part du département de management d'HEC et de l'OBVIA qui a collaboré à l'organisation de ce séminaire. Bonne fin de journée à tout le monde.